This is the story of how a man stranded in Chicago built a billion-dollar empire out of his last $65 and leftover cheese scraps. James Kraft was born in Fort Erie, Ontario, to farmers George and Minerva Kraft in 1874. James was raised to work hard and adhere to strict rules. He maintained those values after graduating from high school by working as a clerk in a general store. James worked at the shop for several years before deciding he wanted more. So he packed his belongings and relocated to Buffalo, New York, to work as the Shepherd Cheese Company's secretary and treasurer. After only a year, James had proven his worth and was made a partner in the company. The following week, he was dispatched to Chicago to inspect a company branch. James received devastating news while he was there. The other partners decided to call it quits, leaving James with only $65 to his name. He decided to take a chance and start his own business in an industry. He was already familiar with cheese. James rented a horse and carriage and drove to Chicago's warehouse district, where he purchased stacks of wholesale cheese. He sold the cheese to stores throughout the city, saving them the trip to the district. 6 years later, James's wholesale cheese business had grown so large that he was able to hire his brothers to assist him. They formed as J.L. Kraft and Brothers Coke before shortening it to Kraft. James had enlisted help at the perfect time, little did he know. More Americans than ever before were working long hours in physically demanding factory jobs, with little time to prepare their meals. This prompted them to turn to dairy products, which have numerous advantages such as being high in nutrition, and being less expensive and easier to obtain than staples such as bread and eggs. However, dairy products, particularly cheese, were susceptible to spoilage and could even lead to the deadly disease, as were most foods at the time. Tuberculosis. While cheese was in high demand in America, businesses in the industry lost money due to spoilage. Fortunately, cheesemakers named Walter Gerber and Fritz Stettler were working on a solution halfway around the world, in Switzerland. We're developing a method to create processed cheese that will be more resistant to spoilage and last longer. First, Walter and Fritz heated Emmental cheese to kill harmful bacteria that could cause disease. Pasteurization was thought to be a mysterious technique. Walter and Fritz discovered at the time that when applied to cheese, the fat and oil separated, resulting in gooey gobs floating in liquid. Fortunately, the two discovered a solution that not only fixed the problem but also allowed them to achieve their goal after heating their cheese. To capitalize on their success, Walter and Fritz added sodium citrate and created a breakthrough emulsifier that not only kept the fat and oil together, but also made the cheese more resistant to spoilage and last longer. The cheesemakers sold their Emmental-based Swiss processed cheese in small tin cans. Back in America, James realized that if he could figure out how to make his own processed cheese, he could turn his company into the first national cheese brand and make a fortune. James began his experiments by heating a jar to kill harmful bacteria, and then filling it with leftover cheddar cheese. When that failed, he tried sealing the cheese inside cans, but that also failed. James eventually used the same obscure technique that Walter and Fritz had, pasteurization. But, like the other cheesemakers, James experienced fat and oil separation, resulting in gooey gobs floating in liquid. Dedicated to success, James had many sleepless nights trying to come up with a solution. It took another 2 years for him to make his own breakthrough. James, like Walter and Fritz, added sodium phosphate to his cheese and discovered that it also kept the fat and oil together, making the cheese more resistant to spoilage and lasting longer. It also had a fantastic flavor. James purchased his first factory after perfecting the recipe and began selling his American processed cheese, made with cheddar, in small tin cans. While many consumers were still concerned about the spoilage of cheese, others were eager to try James's invention. And as time passed, interest grew, and within a year of launching Kraft sales, it had risen from 5,000 to 150,000. As a result, James decided to file a patent for his American processed cheese. Fortunately, it wasn't long before it was approved. James could now easily focus on national expansion. However, it wasn't long before everything changed. When the First World War broke out and President Woodrow Wilson declared the United States would remain neutral, James and every other American were shocked. However, after nearly 3 years, the United States announced that it would enter the war and send millions of troops overseas. Because the US military was so unprepared, finding a way to keep soldiers from going hungry was a challenge. James contacted the United States government and offered to sell them his processed cheese. They accepted James's offer because his cheese was high in nutrition, lasted longer than regular cheese, and was easy to ship. The US government had spent £6 million, or $119 million in sales, by the end of the war. Kraft quickly began to expand across the United States and establish a global presence. The war had unexpectedly aided James in his goal of establishing Kraft as the first national cheese brand. But, unbeknownst to him, it would also be the reason why his company would soon struggle to maintain its leadership position. When the United States entered the war, President Wilson imposed an alcohol ban in order to conserve grain for food. While the ban was intended to be temporary, it became a national law, and many breweries chose to close, while others began to consider new products to sell. One of the country's largest breweries was likely among those who refused to give up. Perhaps it had been in the beer business for a long time and was now run by the founder's son, Gustav. Gustav had attempted to keep the family business afloat by selling muesli, but it was insufficient. He eventually made the difficult decision to shut down the pharmacies. Gustav's younger estranged brother, Fred, was shocked. Although he had left perhaps years ago to pursue his own ventures, he was very sentimental and didn't want the family business to disappear. So, much to his brother's surprise, Fred reached out and vowed to save the company. Not long after returning to Popst, Fred had an idea to save the company that was attempting to manufacture and sell processed cheese. It was a brilliant idea, considering that if Fred was successful, he could use poultry farms, manufacturing facilities, and distribution networks. Fortunately, Fred was successful, and he went on to create Paps, a processed cheese product available in cheddar, pimento, or Swiss and sold in crocks. When that album first hit the shelves, people fell in love with it. Perhaps she was quick to capitalize on the demand by releasing cookbooks with various recipes using the cheese spread within the first year of its release. Perhaps this raises the company's gross profit to $22 million. Around this time, James discovered what he thought was a copycat of his invention and filed a patent infringement lawsuit against Past. 3 years later, the lawsuit went to trial in court. Possibly to argue that it wasn't infringing on Kraft's patents because their processed cheese recipe was different. Nonetheless, after an 8-month trial, Kraft won their case because their patent covered the processed cheese method rather than the recipe, and perhaps their method was very similar to theirs. Rather than brag about his victory, James made an unexpected offer, granting them a license to use their patent in exchange for a fee. Perhaps they put aside their bitterness and agreed that from then on, Kraft would tighten its grip on the cheese market, acquiring competing products like Velveeta cheese and Philadelphia cream cheese. Even after the prohibition ended, the company continued to innovate with new products that became household staples. Specifically, Kraft macaroni and cheese and Kraft singles. Kraft eventually gained control of half of the processed cheese market, and when it went public, it raised more than $8 billion, making it the second largest IPO in US history. Kraft's success drew the attention of world-famous investor Warren Buffett, who spearheaded a merger between Kraft and Heinz. Today, Kraft Heinz is one of the world's largest food companies, and people all over the world continue to eat processed cheese on almost everything from burgers to macaroni and nachos. In fact, Americans spend an average of £40 per year on cheese. This is the story of how a man stranded in Chicago used his last $65 and leftover cheese scraps to build a billion-dollar Kraft empire. Which of the following facts was your favorite in this video? Let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to turn on the notification bell, like and subscribe for more.